Evelyn almost missed them. At 4 a.m. the sidewalk was a blur of grey slush and black ice, but a flash of bright blue nylon halted her exhausted march. There, wedged between the brick wall of a closed bakery and a frost-covered trash bin, sat two impossibly small figures. They weren't moving. They were huddled together, a single layer of snow beginning to dust their shoulders like statues in a park. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. In the dead silence of the Minnesota night, the sight of two children sitting alone on the freezing pavement wasn't just sad. It was a terrifying glitch in reality that made her blood run colder than the wind. 6 hours before the world stopped making sense, the only crisis Evelyn Moore knew was the one sitting on her living room carpet. The apartment was small, a second-floor walk-up that smelled of boiled pasta and damp wool. It was 9 p.m., and the silence of the apartment was heavy. Evelyn knelt on the floor, surrounded by a graveyard of footwear. This was her nightly ritual, a grim inventory of poverty. She held up a child's sneaker to the fading yellow light of the hallway. The sole was worn paper-thin, a hole forming near the big toe like a silent scream. She had 5 children, 10 feet and a bank account that had been empty since Tuesday. Evelyn picked up a roll of silver duct tape from the side table. It was the only cobbler she could afford. With the precision of a surgeon, she wrapped the tape around the toe of her son Silas's boot, sealing the crack that had let the snow in yesterday. The ripping sound of the tape, zart, was loud in the quiet room. It sounded like her own patience snapping. "Just hold on," she whispered to the shoe. "Just get us through March." She was a widow at 34. 2 years ago, a patch of black ice and a distracted truck driver had taken Mark. With him went the second income, the health insurance and the feeling that everything would be okay. Now Evelyn was a ghost in her own life, haunting the night shift at the public library just to keep the radiator hissing. She placed the taped boot back in the row. 5 pairs, some too small, some falling apart, none of them warm enough for a Minnesota winter. She stood up, her knees popping, and pulled on her own coat. It was a shapeless grey wool thing that had lost its warmth 3 winters ago. She wrapped a scarf around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. She checked the lock on the door 3 times, an obsessive tic she had developed since becoming the sole protector, and stepped out into the hallway. The walk to the library was 6 blocks of punishment. Duluth in January was a beautiful prison of ice. The wind whipped off Lake Superior, stinging her exposed skin like needles. The street lamps cast long, lonely shadows that stretched out before her, distorting her silhouette until she looked like a giant, though she felt incredibly small. If you are feeling the weight of Evelyn's struggle and want to see how she battles this impossible winter, please help us by subscribing to the channel right now. We are on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, so the platform allows us to keep producing these emotional cinematic stories. Your click truly helps us continue. Inside the library, the air was still and smelled of lemon polish and old paper. This was her kingdom, from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. She preferred the books to people. Books didn't look at her with pity. Books didn't ask how she was managing with 5 kids alone. Books just waited to be dusted. She began her routine in the children's section. As she pushed the heavy industrial mop across the linoleum, the rhythmic squeak echoed in the cavernous room. She scrubbed a dried juice stain off a small round table, rubbing until her knuckles turned white. It was unjust, she thought. It was unjust that she worked until her back throbbed, yet she still had to decide which child got a winter coat and which one had to layer 3 sweaters. The anger rose in her chest, hot and suffocating, but she swallowed it down. Anger took energy, and she needed every ounce for the floor. By the time her shift ended, exhaustion hung on her like wet clothes. She packed away the cleaning supplies, the smell of bleach clinging to her hands like a second skin. It was 4:15 a.m. when she pushed the heavy glass doors open. The temperature had dropped. The city was a desolate landscape of grey and white. Evelyn kept her head down, watching her boots navigate the slush, counting the steps to keep her mind off the numbness in her toes. 1, 2, 3. She was 2 blocks from her apartment building when the sound cut through the wind. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind whistling through a cracked gutter. But then it came again, a rhythmic, hiccuping sound, a sob. It was low and intermittent, the sound of someone who had been crying for a long time and had no energy left for volume. Evelyn stopped, her heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the street. Nothing but parked cars buried in snowbanks and the dark windows of sleeping houses. She looked toward the alleyway. The shadows were deep there. No, she whispered to herself. Her survival instinct kicked in violently. She had 5 children sleeping at home. She had a babysitter who needed to be paid. She had 0 margin for error. If she stopped, if she got involved, it would be a complication. Complications cost money. Complications brought social services. She was barely keeping her own family afloat. She couldn't pull anyone else out of the water. She tightened her scarf. She gripped her purse strap until her fingers hurt. She looked straight ahead at the safety of her apartment building looming in the distance. It was warm there. It was safe. She forced her legs to move. She walked past the alley. 1 step. The sobbing didn't stop. 2 steps. The wind howled, trying to drown out the noise, but the whimpering cut right through it. 3 steps. The image of the duct-taped boots flashed in her mind, the feeling of absolute helplessness. She ignored it, took 3 steps, and then turned back. Evelyn's boots crunched through the crust of ice that had formed over the snow, a harsh sound that seemed too loud for the stillness of the pre-dawn street. Every step toward the alley felt heavy, weighted down by a dread she couldn't name, but felt in the marrow of her bones. As she got closer, the bundle of colorful fabric separated into 2 distinct shapes. They were sitting on the concrete step of a side entrance to the laundromat, huddled together like birds weathering a storm. The larger one was a girl, maybe 6 years old, her hair a tangled mess of curls poking out from under a thin knitted hat. Wrapped inside her arms, his face pressed into the side of her coat, was a smaller boy. He was the source of the sound, a low, shivering whimper that vibrated through the freezing air. Evelyn knelt in the slush. The cold immediately soaked through the knees of her work pants, biting at her skin, but she didn't feel it. She was too focused on the 4 eyes that suddenly snapped up to meet hers. "Hey," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking. The steam from her breath hung between them like a ghost. "You 2 are freezing." The girl didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She had the guarded, watchful look of a child who had learned to be an adult too soon. Her eyes were dark and wide, rimmed with red from the cold. She held the boy tighter, her small, mitten-clad hands clutching his jacket. "We're waiting," the girl said. Her voice was steady, shockingly calm for a child sitting in a snowbank at 4 in the morning. It was a clarity that broke Evelyn's heart more than tears would have. "Who are you waiting for, honey?" Evelyn asked, keeping her distance, trying to appear harmless. "Mama," the girl answered. She pointed a trembling finger toward the end of the street, into the dark void where the streetlights ended. She went to get help. She said the car wouldn't start and she had to find a phone. She said, "Stay right here." Evelyn looked down the empty street. There was nothing. No footprints leading away, no headlights cutting through the gloom, no sign of life, just the wind pushing empty soda cans across the asphalt. "How long ago was that?" Evelyn asked gently. The girl shrugged, a small, stiff movement. "A while. My toes hurt." The boy, hearing a new voice, turned his head. His face was streaked with frozen tears, his cheeks chapped raw by the wind. He looked about 4, the same age as Evelyn's youngest, Silas. He didn't speak. He just stared at Evelyn with a look of pure, exhausted confusion. "I'm Irie," the girl said, answering the question Evelyn hadn't asked yet. "This is Noam." "I'm Evelyn," she said. She reached out slowly and touched Noam's cheek with the back of her hand. He was cold, dangerously cold. His skin felt like marble. Panic flared in Evelyn's chest, sharp and hot. This wasn't just uncomfortable. This was the kind of cold that killed. She stood up abruptly, her mind racing. She pulled her phone from her purse, her fingers stiff and clumsy. She had to call someone. The police? No. The police meant questions. The police meant separation. If the mother was just down the block, facing a dead battery, the police might take these kids into custody before she even got back. Evelyn knew the system. It was a blunt instrument, not a helping hand. She dialed the number for emergency social services. She held the phone to her ear, pacing a small circle in the snow, watching the kids like a hawk. "Thank you for calling. Our offices are currently closed. If this is a medical emergency, hang up and dial 911. For all other inquiries, please call back between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., Monday through Friday." The robotic voice was cheerful, polite, and utterly useless. 8 a.m., Evelyn hissed, ending the call. She looked at her watch. It was 4:35 a.m., 3.5 hours. She looked back at Erie and Nome. The wind picked up, swirling snow around their small boots. Nome buried his face back into his sister's coat, his shoulders shaking with renewed sobbing. The temperature was dropping as the sun threatened to rise. This was the coldest part of the night. Evelyn felt the weight of her own life pressing down on her. Her apartment was 6 blocks away. It was small. It was crowded. There was barely enough milk for cereal in the morning. Bringing 2 strangers into her home was insanity. It was a breach of the fortress she had built to protect her own children. What if they were sick? What if the mother came back and thought they were kidnapped? What if she couldn't feed them? But then she looked at Erie's sneakers. They were canvas, summer shoes. The snow had packed around the ankles, turning the fabric dark and wet. Evelyn closed her eyes for a second, fighting the logic that told her to walk away, to call the police anonymously and let them handle it. But she couldn't. She remembered the duct tape on Silas's boots. She remembered the nights she had cried into her pillow, wishing someone, anyone, would just help her carry the load for 5 minutes. She wasn't a hero. She was just a mother who knew what freezing felt like. "Okay," Evelyn said, her voice firm. She crouched down again. "Irie, listen to me. My house is just down the street. It's warm there. I have blankets." Irie hesitated, her eyes darting back to the empty street corner. "Mama said wait here." "I know," Evelyn said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "But Mama wouldn't want you to turn into an icicle, right? We'll leave a note. If she comes back, she'll know where you are. But we can't stay here. Nome is too cold." At the mention of her brother, Erie's resolve cracked. She looked down at the boy, then back at Evelyn. She nodded, a tiny, defeated motion. Evelyn didn't have paper for a note. She frantically searched her purse and found an old library receipt. With a shaking hand, she wrote her address on the back of it using a pen that barely had ink left. She jammed the paper into the crack of the brick wall, right at eye level, praying the wind wouldn't steal it. "Come on," Evelyn said. She reached out. Gary stood up first, her legs stiff. She didn't take Evelyn's hand. Instead, she hauled Noam up by his arm. The boy stumbled, his legs heavy with cold. Evelyn didn't ask permission this time. She scooped Noam up into her arms. He was surprisingly light, a bundle of hollow bones and cold clothes. He didn't fight her. He just rested his frozen head on her shoulder, seeking the warmth of her neck. "Grab my pocket," Evelyn told Irie, offering the side of her wool coat. Erie gripped the fabric tight. They began the walk. 6 blocks had never felt so long. The wind pushed against them, trying to shove them back, but Evelyn leaned into it. She carried the weight of the strange child and the heavy reality of what she was doing. Every step took her further away from the safety of her routine and deeper into uncharted territory. She told herself this was temporary. She told herself she was just a way station, a warm stopover until the sun came up and the offices opened. She would give them oatmeal, let them thaw out, and then hand them over to the professionals. It was only until dawn, she thought, just until the world wakes up. She reached her building, fumbling for her keys with one hand while holding Noam with the other. She ushered them inside, the heavy door slamming shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the wind. The silence of the hallway felt sudden and profound. Evelyn looked at the 2 children standing on the dirty mat of her apartment building. They looked like refugees from a war she didn't understand. She unlocked her apartment door and pushed it open, the smell of her own sleeping children drifting out to greet them. She thought she was just saving them from the cold, but that night would change everything. The apartment door clicked shut, severing the connection to the howling wind outside. But the silence inside didn't last long. The sudden intrusion of 3 people, 1 soaking wet woman and 2 frozen strangers, into a 2-bedroom apartment that was already bursting at the seams, disrupted the fragile ecosystem of the Moore household. Evelyn peeled the wet coats off Irie and Noam. The fabric was heavy and smelled of damp exhaust fumes and old snow. Underneath, their clothes were thin, pajama tops worn as shirts, pants that were too short for their ankles. As the warmth of the radiator hit them, the adrenaline that had kept them moving began to fade, replaced by the painful prickling of thawing nerves. Noam let out a wail. It wasn't the low whimper from the street anymore. It was a full-throated scream of confusion and pain as the blood rushed back into his frozen fingers. In the living room, the pile of mattresses shifted. 5 heads popped up from the tangle of blankets. "Mum?" The voice belonged to Maya, her eldest at 12. She rubbed sleep from her eyes, squinting in the hallway light. "What's happening? What time is it?" "Go back to sleep, Maya," Evelyn whispered, though she knew it was futile. Noam's crying was a siren. One by one, the more children woke up. Marcus, 10, sat up, looking grumpy. Silas, 8, rubbed his eyes. The twins, Lucas and Sarah, 5, immediately started crying because someone else was crying. The small living room, usually a carefully orchestrated puzzle of sleeping bodies, descended into chaos. "Who are they?" Marcus asked, staring at the 2 strangers shivering in the entryway. "Why are they wet?" "They're staying with us for a little bit," Evelyn said, her voice tight. She was already moving to the kitchen, filling a pot with water for oatmeal. It was too early for breakfast, but food was the only comfort she could offer. She calculated the oats in the jar. If she made it watery, there would be enough for 7 bowls. Just barely. The friction was immediate. The apartment was a tiny vessel, and it had just taken on too much cargo. When Evelyn ushered Irie and Noam into the living room, the territorial lines were drawn. "That's my pillow," Lucas whined as Evelyn tried to settle Noam onto the edge of a mattress. "There's no room," Maya muttered, pulling her knees to her chest. "Mum, where are they going to sleep? We're already touching the walls." "We make room," Evelyn snapped, sharper than she intended. The exhaustion was a physical weight on her shoulders, heavy as lead. "Shift over now." The resentment in the room was palpable, thick as the steam rising from the radiator. It wasn't that her children were cruel. They were just survivors of their own drought. They knew exactly how limited the resources were. A new person meant less hot water. A new person meant a smaller slice of bread. 2 new people felt like an invasion. Irie sat on the edge of the mattress, her eyes wide and terrified, scanning the faces of the Moore children. She looked like a cornered animal. Noam was still sobbing, a jagged, rhythmic sound that grated on everyone's nerves. "I want my mama," Noam choked out, his face buried in his hands. "I want to go home." "He won't stop," Marcus complained, covering his ears with his hands. "Make him stop." The tension in the room spiked. It was a powder keg of poverty and exhaustion, and the match had been lit. Evelyn stood in the kitchenette, stirring the gruel-like oatmeal, fighting the urge to scream herself. She felt like a captain trying to keep a sinking ship afloat by bailing water with a teaspoon. She turned off the stove and walked into the living room. She needed to change the atmosphere before it suffocated them all. "Quiet," Evelyn said. She didn't shout. She used her library voice, low, commanding, and absolute. The room fell silent, save for Noam's hiccuping sobs. Evelyn sat down on the floor, right in the center of the mattress mosaic. She ignored the lack of space. She ignored the cold draft coming from the window. "Does anyone know the story of the elastic house?" she asked, looking from her children to the strangers. The twins shook their heads. Maya rolled her eyes but leaned in slightly. "Once upon a time," Evelyn began, her voice taking on a melodic rhythm, "there was a house that was very, very small. It was no bigger than a shoebox. A mouse lived there." Noam stopped crying to listen. Irie blinked, her guard lowering just an inch. One day a rabbit came knocking. It was raining hard. The rabbit said, "I have nowhere to go." The mouse looked at his tiny shoebox and said, "Oh no, we won't fit." "But do you know what the house did?" Evelyn demonstrated with her hands, expanding them wide. The walls took a deep breath, whoosh, and stretched, just enough for the rabbit. She made eye contact with Marcus, who was still frowning. "Then a bear came," Evelyn continued, "a big grumpy bear who was cold, and the mouse and the rabbit said, 'Impossible, a bear is too big.' But the house knew a secret. The house knew that walls aren't made of wood or brick. They're made of kindness, and kindness stretches forever. So the house took another deep breath, whoosh, and suddenly there was room for the bear. The room was quiet now. The hostility had evaporated, replaced by the hypnotic power of the story. It was a lie, of course. Walls didn't stretch. Landlords didn't care about kindness, but for 10 minutes in the dark of a frozen morning, they needed the magic more than the truth. Evelyn got up and served the oatmeal. It was thin and bland, but it was hot. She handed the bowls out. There were no complaints about the portion sizes. As they ate, the reality of the sleeping arrangements became the next hurdle. There were no spare blankets. The Moore children were already doubling up. Erie and Noam sat on the floor, shivering despite the food. Their clothes were drying, but the chill had settled deep in their bones. Erie was trying to wrap her own thin cardigan around Noam's shoulders, but it wasn't enough. He was shaking, his teeth chattering with a sound like dice in a cup. Evelyn looked around, calculating what she could sacrifice. Her own coat, the curtains. Then movement caught her eye. Silas, her middle child, stood up. Silas was the quiet one. He was the one who walked around with duct tape on his boots to save her the shame of asking for new ones. He was the one who noticed when she skipped dinner so they could have seconds. He walked over to where Noam was sitting. Without a word, Silas unclipped the blanket from around his own shoulders. It was his favorite, a faded fleece with spaceships on it, the one thing that was exclusively his in a world where everything was shared. The room watched, holding its breath. Silas draped the blanket over Noam. He tucked the edges in around the shivering boy's shoulders, patting it down awkwardly. "It's warm," Silas said simply. "It has rockets." Noam looked up, his eyes huge. He pulled the fleece tight under his chin. For the first time all night, his shivering stopped. Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat, hot and sharp. She looked at her son, her brave, quiet boy who had nothing, giving away the only comfort he owned. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated grace amidst the squalor. It broke her heart and healed it all at once. "Okay," Evelyn whispered, blinking back tears. "Everyone down. Sleep. Just for a few hours." The children settled. The elastic house had stretched just enough. Bodies were rearranged. Erie and Noam curled up under the spaceship blanket. Silas squeezed in next to Marcus, who grumbled but lifted his own sheet to share. Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen chair, watching the rise and fall of 7 small chests. She watched the window turn from black to bruised purple, then to a stark, unforgiving grey. She had survived the night. She had kept them alive. But as the sun finally breached the horizon, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. It wasn't the tentative knock of a neighbor. It was heavy, urgent, and official. Evelyn stood up, her heart plummeting to her stomach. She walked to the door, her hand hovering over the knob. In the morning the truth appeared. The knock came again, 3 rapid, desperate thuds against the peeling paint of the door. It wasn't the rhythmic pound of the police or the authoritative rap of a landlord. It was frantic. Evelyn glanced back at the living room. 7 children were still asleep, a tangle of limbs and breath under a patchwork of blankets. She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door open just a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. A woman stood in the hallway. She looked like a mirror image of Evelyn's own exhaustion, but shattered. Her hair was wet and plastered to her skull. Her face was grey with cold, and her eyes were wild, darting past Evelyn into the sliver of the apartment visible behind her. She wore a coat that was too thin for October, let alone January in Duluth. "My babies!" the woman choked out. Her voice was a raw scrape of sound. "Please, the note. I found the note in the wall." Evelyn studied her. There was no malice in the woman's face, only a terrifying, hollowed-out panic. Evelyn undid the chain and opened the door. The woman stumbled in, bringing the smell of the frozen street with her. She didn't look at Evelyn. Her eyes went straight to the living room floor, where Irie and Noam were sleeping under the spaceship blanket. She collapsed to her knees right there in the entryway, a marionette whose strings had been cut. She didn't rush to wake them. She just covered her mouth with her hands and sobbed, a silent, shaking release of terror. "I'm Lyndon," she whispered after a minute, wiping her nose on her sleeve. I'm their mother. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Evelyn led her to the kitchen table, the only neutral ground in the apartment. She poured the last of the coffee into a chipped mug and placed it in Lyndon's trembling hands. "Tell me what happened," Evelyn said, keeping her voice low. Lyndon's story spilled out in a fractured, frantic stream. It was a litany of bad luck that Evelyn knew by heart. The car battery died. The phone died. She walked 3 miles to a gas station, but the attendant wouldn't let her use the phone unless she bought something, and she had no money. She panicked. She got lost in the snow. By the time she got back to the spot, the children were gone, and only Evelyn's receipt was wedged in the brick. "I'm not a bad mom," Lyndon pleaded, looking up at Evelyn with eyes that begged for judgment to be withheld. I can't catch a break. I lost my job at the diner 2 weeks ago. We've been sleeping in the car for 3 nights. I was just trying to get us to my sister in Wisconsin." She took a shaky sip of the coffee. Then she said the thing that sucked the air out of the room. I think I have to give them up." The words hung in the kitchen, heavy and poisonous. Evelyn froze. "What?" "I called the state from the shelter phone this morning," Lyndon admitted, staring into the black coffee. "I can't keep them warm. I can't feed them. Look at me. I'm killing them by trying to keep them. If I give them to the system, at least they'll have a bed. At least they won't freeze to death on a sidewalk while I'm looking for a jump start." It was a confession born of absolute love and absolute defeat. Evelyn looked at this woman and saw herself. She saw the nights she had stared at the empty fridge and wondered if her own children would be better off with strangers who had full bank accounts. It was the darkest thought a mother could have, the choice no one wanted to make. "The system isn't a warm bed, Lyndon," Evelyn said, her voice hard. "It's a warehouse. They'll split them up. Irie goes to one house, Noam to another. They won't see each other. They won't see you." "But they'll be alive," Lyndon's voice rose, cracking. "I can't do this anymore. I don't have anywhere to go." The kitchen fell silent. From the living room, the sound of waking children began to stir, a rustle of blankets, a yawn. Evelyn looked around her apartment. She looked at the peeling wallpaper. She looked at the stack of overdue bills on the counter. She had nothing. She was drowning. Adding 3 more people to this life raft was suicide. It was illogical. It was impossible. But then she thought of Silas giving up his blanket. She thought of the elastic house. She thought of the silence of the library at 3 a.m. and how lonely the world was when you were fighting it solo. The system was a machine. It didn't care. Evelyn cared. She stood up. The decision hit her not as a thought, but as a physical necessity. She couldn't let those kids go into the dark machinery of the state, and she couldn't let this woman break into pieces because of a dead car battery. "No," Evelyn said. Lyndon looked up, confused. "No, you're not calling them," Evelyn said firmly. "And you're not leaving." "I don't understand," Lyndon stammered. "You saw us. We have nothing." "I have nothing too," Evelyn said. She gestured around the cramped kitchen. "I have 5 kids, a part-time job, and a landlord who hates me. I have no space. I have no money." She leaned across the table, locking eyes with Lyndon. "But I have a roof. And I work nights. You need a place to be during the day. You can be here. You watch the kids while I sleep. I watch them while you look for work. We split the food. We split the worry." Lyndon stared at her, her mouth slightly open. "You don't even know me. Why would you do that?" "Because last night I almost walked past your children," Evelyn said, the shame of that memory stinging her eyes. "I almost left them there because I was scared I didn't have enough to give. I was wrong." She walked to the fridge and opened it. It was grim, 1/2 gallon of milk, a wilting head of lettuce, some eggs. "It's not enough," Evelyn said, turning back to Lyndon, "but it's more than you have out there." Lyndon started to cry again, but this time it wasn't the frantic sobbing of panic. It was the slow, heavy release of relief. She put her head down on the table. Evelyn didn't hug her. She didn't offer false promises that it would be easy. Instead, she walked to the door of the apartment. She didn't open it to let Lyndon out. She locked it. She didn't open the door for the world to come in and fix them. She opened her own life, messy and broken as it was, and made room for the wreckage of another. "Wash your face," Evelyn commanded gently. "The kids are waking up. We need to figure out how to stretch 5 eggs for 9 people." Evelyn's apartment, already bursting at the seams, transformed into a logistical nightmare. 9 people sharing one bathroom meant schedules were written on the back of old envelopes and taped to the door. 9 people eating meant meals were stretched so thin they were practically translucent. Soup became broth, and broth became hot water with a memory of flavor. The noise was constant, a chaotic symphony of shouting, crying, and the relentless thump-thump of feet on the floorboards that made the downstairs neighbor bang on his ceiling with a broom handle. But chaos, strangely, began to settle into a rhythm. Evelyn worked the night shift at the library, her body screaming for sleep she couldn't afford. During the day, while she collapsed into a few precious hours of unconsciousness, Lyndon took over. Lyndon wasn't just a guest, she was a whirlwind of gratitude and desperation. She cleaned the apartment until the windows sparkled. She mended clothes with a needle and thread she found in a drawer. She wrangled 7 children with a fierce, protective energy that freed Evelyn from the constant, grinding worry of childcare. They were 2 mothers, one shift apart, keeping a single, fragile boat afloat. The breakthrough didn't come from money. It came from visibility. It started with the library. Evelyn's supervisor, Mrs. Gable, a stern woman who usually only spoke in hushed tones, noticed the dark circles under Evelyn's eyes deepening. One morning, instead of a reprimand for a missed spot on the floor, she found Evelyn asleep in the break room, her head resting on a stack of picture books. "Evelyn?" Mrs. Gable said softly, waking her. Evelyn jumped, terrifyingly awake. "I'm sorry. I was just—" "Stop," Mrs. Gable interrupted. She placed a heavy paper bag on the table. Inside were 3 loaves of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bag of apples. "It's from the food drive box. We had extra. Don't let it go to waste." It wasn't a fortune, but it was 3 days of lunches. Then it was the school. Marcus's teacher noticed he was sharing his sandwich with a new boy in the cafeteria, Noam, who wasn't enrolled but had been sneaking in with the older kids for warmth and company. Instead of calling social services, the teacher called the principal. The principal called the local community center. 2 days later, a box appeared at Evelyn's door. It wasn't from a charity. It was from the parents of room 3B. Inside were winter coats, not new but warm, boots that didn't need duct tape, a grocery store gift card with $50 on it. The impossible happened not because of a grand gesture, but because the community saw a crack in the pavement and decided to fill it with flowers instead of cement. Lyndon found a job 3 weeks later. It was part-time, stocking shelves at a grocery store on the other side of town, but it was a paycheck. The first thing she bought wasn't for herself. She came home with a gallon of real milk, not the powdered kind, and a box of chocolate cereal. That night, for the first time in months, there was laughter in the apartment. Genuine, belly-deep laughter, as 7 children argued over who got the blue bowl. Evelyn sat at the small kitchen table watching them. She was exhausted. Her back ached. Her bank account was still laughable. But the knot of dread that had lived in her chest for 2 years had loosened, just a fraction. "We did it," Lyndon whispered, standing next to her, watching Irie help Silas with a math problem. "We survived February." Evelyn nodded, too tired to speak. The next morning, the air in Duluth had changed. It was still freezing, but the sun was brighter, carrying the faint, distant promise of spring. It was a Tuesday. The morning routine was a well-oiled machine now. Lyndon was packing lunches. Evelyn was braiding hair. "Boots on," Evelyn called out. 7 pairs of feet stomped into the entryway. There was no duct tape today, there were no holes. They spilled out of the apartment building like a colorful tide. Red coats, blue hats, yellow scarves. They walked in a pack, a small army of resilience against the grey world. Irie held Noam's hand. Marcus carried a backpack that looked too big for him. Silas walked with his head high. Evelyn stood at the window watching them go. She saw her own children mixed with Lyndon's, a seamless blend of need and support. She saw the neighbors watching, some with judgment, some with curiosity, but none with the power to stop them. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass. She had no space, she had no money, she had no guarantee that next month wouldn't break them all. But as she watched the 7 children turn the corner, disappearing safely toward the school, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the radiator. She hadn't just opened her door, she had broken down the walls, and in doing so she had built something stronger than a house. She didn't have space, nor money, Evelyn whispered to the empty room, a small smile touching her lips. But she had courage, and that was enough. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can share more stories of hope, resilience, and the power of human connection.